Welcome everyone to the first episode of Closing Time with Pat and Denis. So I'm Dennis Crushell and this is...
I am Pat Williams. Welcome.
Welcome. Hopefully you've heard our first episode together as a duo from the Coffee for Scalers podcast. And this is our first episode of this podcast. And today we're going to talk mostly about Pat's experience where he has failed 4 first startups, right, Pat?
That's
correct. As a VP of sales.
Painful to admit, yes. My first 4 startups.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. If failure was a metric that people measured, I'd be like stellar.
Yeah. Great. Cool. So let's kick off then, Pat. Yeah. From your experience failing as a VP of sales at these startups, what was kind of the biggest misconception you had about success in that role? And also, I was going to ask, what changed your perspective?
Yeah. So probably the biggest misconception I had, because I had come from working in technology companies it was all about the product and pushing the product. But they were more established, right? They had already gotten, traction in their particular markets and that's the thing. And so I think the biggest misconception I had was this idea that, if your company had the best product or technology, that you would have a really high probability of being successful, right? And, I guess because of the multiple failures that I experienced during my first several startups, I realized that maybe that's not a truism. And so, how I went about, I guess, or what changed my perspective was the failures, right? And so what I was doing was I was trying to solve for, okay, well, if this is not the case, right? I started to kind of seek out, understanding, I guess, what people or companies were really trying to do or accomplish if they were to have a project or an initiative that used my product, so to speak, right? And not just, okay, well, what is the formal specifications that they wanted with respect to this project, whether it was in an RFP or anything like that, but more from the perspective of what was the process or outcome that they were trying to get for that business unit or for that business, as the case may be, right? So that was the first thing that I started kind of exploring and helped change my perspective. And the second thing, and maybe even more important is if they didn't go forward with the initiative, or if they didn't buy my solution as a tech startup or whatever it happens to be, right? Why weren't they doing that? And they did actually, engage with somebody as opposed to not doing anything, right? Why was that the case? And I tried to look at it not from the product specs perspective, just like I mentioned in the first one, but more from the business. What was the reasons why the business wasn't moving forward with my solution versus somebody else? And it typically boiled down to, a couple things. It usually had something to do with risk. It usually had something to do with the friction of being able to assimilate whatever solution or, product that we were trying to get them to buy off on. Yeah. And it also had something to do with, I'll call it the value, or call it the economics or process value or whatever you want to call it, right? And so that was what I learned by kind of prompting the question of why didn't you move forward with someone like us, other than we didn't meet the specification in a detailed requirements document or whatever it happens to be. Yeah. And so through that, I guess, doing that type of, I'll call it educating or investigating, whatever, I ended up kind of I knew other people were having success in startups, right? So I'm saying to myself, okay, well, what is it I need to know in order to create the same success that these other people were doing? And so I kind of created my hypothesis by, I'll call it, marrying what I observed from, friends of mine or colleagues that went to successful startups with the understandings that I got with the, why did they go with us or why didn't they go with us, and what were the business impacts they were trying to accomplish. Yeah. And that's when I kind of came up with what I call the formula for success, which I think you have seen, when you and I started working together. That's how I came up with it. So that's what I guess changed my perspective
Yeah.
after I had done the failing.
Now that you've learned a lot over your career, like what do you look for in those traits of those companies and you recommend to people when they're looking at their next startup to improve the chances of success?
Yeah. So it's part of it is the success formula, and then part of it kind of like what is it that you look for as a
Yeah.
person? What
Yes.
is it that you think that traits or characteristics about the company? So
Yeah.
I'll call it the formula for success that I talk about in this idea of, do you really clearly understand what is the business problem or outcome that you provide to whomever it is, call it your ideal customer profile,
Mm.
that you are trying to target or you think you provide value to? And then is that important and consequential enough to them that they would actually do something about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Back to
And
what you said
then,
earlier. Yeah.
then you need to understand, or you need to be clear from whatever company that you're, considering. Okay, so if you understand who and you understand the problem that you're solving, that is a really important one and has big consequences if they don't solve it,
Yeah.
and they are going to move forward with something or not, as the case may be. But how is it that you're able to uniquely solve for that other people cannot, or how can you do it in an order of magnitude better that the other alternatives cannot, right?
Yeah.
And then you get into the idea of okay, well, so if you were to ask me, when I was out, considering opportunities as a CRO, being recruited or whoever it happens to be, I
Yeah.
would tell people, like if I was asked by a board member or the CEO or whatever, they'd say, well,
Yeah.
what are you looking to do, right? And so I would tell them, I would say, okay, well, I'm looking for, where I can take on a leadership role. I can have some kind of, impact on the success of the company. The company size would be, for me, it was kind of in this 10 million to 50 million in ARR type of size range, right? I would want to be in a certain market segment. In mine, it was kind of on-demand technology solutions for business, right? B2B type of world. And, I particularly like recurring revenue type of business models. And then I would describe things like, well, how big is this opportunity that you guys think that you're going after? Meaning, what could it ultimately look like from a TAM perspective? And I used to use
Yeah.
the term, I would say, I want to play in the Super Bowl, if I'm going to use a sports metaphor, as opposed to playing in a college football, bowl game or something like that, right? I want it to be big, 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 right? And I want to understand, does the company have the ability to position itself in a way that could be clear as to how they can add value to whoever they think their customers are, right? The third thing is that, does this company possess some unique IP, and or do they have a unique business strategy? And the example I would give people when I was describing this was, I said, for example, Southwest Airlines had a unique business strategy. They were in airline transportation, but they thought they were competing against the bus lines and the trains as opposed to the other airlines, if that makes sense. So what I meant by a unique business strategy. And then I wanted to understand, does the company have the financial wherewithal to be able to, achieve their goals, basically, right? Either access the capital or they have the capital in hand. And then did they have, a solid business model?
Yep.
And that's when I was talking about the company itself. So what you would want to investigate. And then the last thing is that if you're going to go on to take something like this and to know whether they have a chance of being successful, you would want to understand like three things about the culture of the company. The first one is it a customer focused company?
Yeah.
Right. And I mean maniacally focused on the customer as opposed to on their operations or on their product or whatever it happens to be. And a good way to understand that, especially in recurring revenue companies, is what is their retention rate of the customers that they brought on? And what is the expansion of those retained customers, right? So that, think of it as net ARR in the world of SaaS. And
SaaS,
like yeah. The second thing is are they sales and marketing driven? And there's an easy way for you to understand that when you're looking, at opportunities that you think can be successful or not. And that is, you go in and you ask them for just, high level financials, their income statement, their balance sheet, and what have you.
Yeah.
And what their plans are for the subsequent year. So their pro forma or whatever it has to be. And what you'll look at is you'll look into that and you'll say, the way that you can tell if they're sales and marketing driven or oriented is what percentage of their operating expenses. So operating expenses
Yeah.
are, R&D, G&A, and then sales and marketing. Right? What percentage of those, when you added them all up, was being allocated to sales and marketing? And in early stage startups, there's kind of a rule of thumb that would say, if they are, if they've got some kind of product market fit, some semblance of product market fit, then they would basically start to allocate more of that operating budget to the sales and marketing efforts. And that usually meant somewhere between 45 and 50% of that operating budget got allocated. That's how you can tell if they're sales. If they're only allocating 25%, they're not sales and marketing driven. They're still operationally driven and product driven. And then the last thing is, in terms of the culture, is the organizationally enabled. And that gets into how does the leadership team operate and what do they value? Meaning, are they more of a, what I call command and control type of, operation?
Yeah.
That could be good and
Yeah.
bad. Or are they more of, I'm going to go ahead and, and get the best people I can possibly get and then empower them and enable them to go out and execute our plan, because that's the way you scale a business.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the traits or characteristics that I sit there and I go, and it's a long list of things. We can certainly publish something on a link after our podcast here. But those are the things that you have to really look at if you're going to be able to determine, is this really going to be a successful opportunity as a startup?
But I would say, right, like, in my experience, if you're looking at a company sometimes and you're like, okay, they're not that customer focused, or they don't spend that much in sales and marketing, or their positioning's wrong. I'd be like, okay, there's an opportunity for me here to come in and potentially change things. But I guess that's dependent on if you can come in with some authority. What's your point of view on that?
Yeah. And so that's why I said it's really important for you to get like some kind of the financial stuff and say, okay, great. Here's where you are. And you're telling me, Mr. or Mrs. CTO, or Mr. or Mrs. CEO, or, the board, that you all feel you don't have a good handle on how to grow and scale this. So what does your, plans look like in terms of the resources that you're planning on allocating in the sales and marketing bucket for the operating plan? Right? And are you all committed to doing that? And, I mean, and why are you committed to doing that? And so that's what I would do, because you're right. You can find companies that, maybe haven't been allocating, that amount of money to a sales and marketing effort. And they're doing okay, right? They've got product market fit and they're kind of growing, but they want to, usually they're coming to get a new CR because they want to grow faster than what they are.
Yeah. But one other thing I would say, right, in this environment where lots of startups out there are struggling to raise money and don't have as much runway as maybe they used to in the past, like spending 45 to 50% of their operating expenditure, to me, that sounds like, will these companies be making any profit at that stage much or not?
Well, I mean,
depends as a percentage, but
I think it's a great question, but it's like, okay, so there's a pie of operating expenses, right? You need to run the business, right? And so you as a business have got to, number one of the things that's kind of going on in today's world is that there's what I call CAC inflation going on, right?
We talked about this the other week.
It's a difficult economic environment, and in terms of a lot of uncertainty with companies, they're trying to cut costs, and they don't know where the market going to start growing again, or is it going to stagnate, or whatever it happens to be. And so that makes it much more difficult for a lot of these startups. So they have to spend more and more, and there's in terms of customer acquisition costs, and the duration of the sales cycles are elongating because of this uncertainty that their customers are experiencing, and or their particular value or their offering or the outcomes that they produce may not be in the top 1, 2, or 3, right? So then you have to pump the brake and ask yourself the question, okay, well, if we know that that's the case, do we go ahead and start to invest more from a product standpoint that maybe
Yeah.
you can somehow come up with a new and improved, and that's an option, right?
Yeah.
It's at the expense of, potentially, missing the boat on the growth part of it in terms of your sales and marketing.
Yeah.
So it's not a hard and fast rule, but if you feel you have this, is, I guess what I'm saying is, and this is somewhat dependent on economic climate, but if you feel
Yeah.
you've got product market fit and you think that your market is expanding or growing and these people are really feeling the pain,
Yeah.
and it's still a priority for them to go about solving it or going about and, capturing the opportunity, and
Yeah.
that's because you're getting that feedback from the marketplace, then you're going to have to do it
Keep
through
going. Yeah.
through a more
Yeah.
sales and marketing focused company as opposed to a product
Yeah.
focused company or an
Yeah.
operationally focused company.
I think it's really important though that like a company knows what they're doing when they if they're going to spend that percentage. Like if they
Absolutely.
don't have a good team in place and stuff, it could be very fast money that they burn. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a little bit like when you're going through product development, right? What you end
Yeah.
up with, and even with startups, right? What they end up with, their original value proposition, a lot of times morphs into something different, right?
Mm,
And so you got to understand that it's a process, and you're going to have to work through that.
yeah.
I'll call it understanding the buying journey and who it
Yeah.
is that's your real ideal customer, and what are you
Yeah.
really helping them with? What's the real business
Yeah.
impact
Yeah.
that
Let's
you're
talk
doing?
about that because I think any role that you come into,
Yeah.
like my role that I started 2.5 years ago, ICP was one of the first things I focused on. And actually, I was just in a session earlier today where we were perfecting it. Like
Awesome.
it's not something that is finished, and
Yeah.
you hope it's not because you hope to bring out more products and stuff as well, like
Yeah.
increasing that TAM or expanding it. But yeah, talk to us about ICP and your
Yeah.
background with going into these companies.
Yeah. So I was really lucky. Early on in my career, I learned from a mentor that, and this gentleman, I remember when I walked into his office the first time, instead of having, like, back then we had cubes and things like that, instead of having
Yeah,
a nameplate with the, name on the side or whatever, it had something totally different. It said prioritize, focus, win, or execute.
that's
But,
good.
and yeah, it was win actually, but and I needed to execute. But anyway, but that was kind of like my first. And this guy was really successful with a number of startups, and that was kind of my first, aha, when I asked him. I said, "Well, what is that about?" And he goes, "This is what I learned when you're going to market with new technology and products and things like that." He was an operation guy, really smart technically and really smart business guy. But he said, "I learned that is the only way that you're going to be able to succeed." And so I kind of took that as okay, well, then this idea of prioritize, focus, win, you need to apply that to whoever it is that you're going to go out and try to serve, right? Or we call it the ideal customer. And so, if I translated that into, like, um, like, for example, focus, right? Well,
Yeah,
in order to focus, you can't just have a general description of an industry or something like that, or a market that you're trying to penetrate. Like, I'm going to be in the utility market. Well, that doesn't really tell you much, right? So,
yeah,
you need to be detailed about, who cares about what you solve that and what is the outcome that they think is the holy grail for them, right?
yeah,
And you need to understand it from not just, okay, well, this is what it is economically, but you understand what that means to them functionally and operationally and from a technology perspective and a services perspective and things like that, right? You can't just go, yeah, this market, and this is kind of what they see as an ROI or an economic benefit, right? So that was the thing as it related to focus, right? You do need to be able to focus and narrow that ICP down.
mm,
Then the second thing is that you have to then prioritize. So the prioritize part of it, where you have the highest probability of success, right? And then spend your time and resources there as opposed to somewhere else, because especially in startups, because time is the one thing is the great equalizer, right? We all get the same amount,
mm,
right? And I'll call it resources, when you're a startup, you don't have as much as some of these larger companies. So, and what that means is that, you need to understand from the perspective of, where is it you have the highest probability of success is, number one, is the problem or outcome you provide these or solve, is it important? Meaning, is it a high priority? And I mean, is it a 1, 2, 3? Not is it a 6, 7, or 8?
Yeah.
Number 2, is it consequential for them to either do something? And if they don't, what does that mean? Right. So that's a really important. And I used to, I'll say you preach that to many of the sales teams, including you and your team.
Yeah.
You really need to understand that. And the last thing is that, is it compelling enough for them? Right. So it might be, important for them. It might be a 1, 2, or 3, and it might be, the consequences could be pretty, dire if they didn't go about doing it, meaning they could go out of business. But is what you're doing compelling enough for them to take the risk? Or can you get them a faster time to them enjoying the benefit, or whatever it happens to be, right? The friction, that sort of stuff. So, and the other thing is that you have to be kind of mindful of when you're putting together your ICP, is this idea is, are you just going to be incremental improvement for whoever it is you think your customer is? And or you're not sufficiently, addressing their needs? Because, and it'll come out in the words of like, well, the current alternatives are good enough, right? It's, we don't need to overkill of what you're doing, right? Or they'll tell you, well, this isn't really, this kind of feels more like a vitamin. It does a pain pill or something.
Yeah.
Like you'll get
it's not good timing, actually, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not urgent. Yeah.
All of these components need to go into how you prioritize your time and resources, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense, right? And then the last part is this thing, win or execute, right? So, and that gets into this idea of, if you look at your ICP, okay, we think we got a pretty good definition of it. We know who it is. We know what they look like. We know what the problems are experiencing, and how that manifests itself in the business, and et cetera, right? Then you got to ask yourself the question, we talked about this earlier, which is there a big enough TAM to support your company's aspirations in terms of their growth, right? Because if not, then it's going to be really difficult for you to execute on that opportunity if it's not big enough.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that you need to have a clear understanding amongst your company and your team.
Yeah.
So that you can, I'll call it, enable the people that are going to go out here and try to, execute against your go-to-market, right? And otherwise you end up with I'll call it a really disjointed, effort, kind of siloed and things like that. And you're wasting money and time, and or marketing is off doing one thing versus sales is doing another. And it just ends up, your execution just deteriorates and goes. So,
Okay.
So there you go. So those are the things that, prioritize, focus, execute is kind of how I view the world of why you need an ICP, or, why it's so important.
Yeah. Makes sense. And, I was going to ask you so the fact that like you personally, right? Like you went into sales leadership pretty young, and like you had some places where you failed, like every salesperson. I've had lots of places as well. Like, what did you, for the audience out there, if they're younger sales leaders or more mature sales leaders, and they're kind of getting into their first sales leadership roles, or like VPs, SVPs, CROs, what advice would you give them on the kind of common mistakes that people make, that you made, even in these early startups?
I think the common mistakes that I made was one, thinking that the best product was going to win. I think the second thing that I learned was that you're only as good as the people that you bring into the organization to help you educate, right? It's really tough to be a one-person white knight. Right? So you really got to kind of nail the whole, I'll call it the people aspect of it. The recruiting, the hiring, and things like that. And then it's the clarity around this, idea that we talked about earlier, which is you need to really understand, whether it's for yourself, for your team, for the company, what is it that you do to somehow help somebody, and in their words, not your words and what you guys talk about, but in their words, right?
Yeah.
Why is it important or consequential? And why it is that you can uniquely resolve that? And then does this ICP or the candidate profile really support that?
Yeah.
And if you can kind of stick to those things. That's kind of what I learned by failing,
Yeah.
multiple times as a CRO. Is like, if you can't continuously, kind of execute against that or be able to assess what it is,
Yeah.
it's going to be a tough road to hoe for you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It's
yeah,
funny actually, like we talk about sometimes that um like with salespeople, you might skin your knees or you might get shot in the leg or something, but not a bullet
yeah.
to the head.
It's a shot to the foot as opposed to a shot
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the
I'm
nostril.
just trying
Yeah,
to think of like when before I worked for you and then you came in and you helped me a lot. And I think some of the things where I went wrong initially, which might be useful for people think listening about you answering that as well, is like I think a lot of sales leaders, this happened me, happened people that I hired, like they try to do a lot themselves when there's like really strong muscle memory of doing
yeah,
the selling themselves and stepping in too much with their team. So kind of like what you were saying about the team piece. And then
yeah,
I think another thing that I've learned or seen a lot is like, and learned myself is like, um, what's that definition of insanity? It's like continuing to do the same thing.
and
What?
expecting a different result. That's Albert
Yeah,
Einstein. Yeah, keep doing the same
yeah.
thing, expecting
And
a different
like
result.
if something's not working,
Yeah,
what's going to give you confidence that it's going to work in 3 months or 6 months? Which I think I know sometimes if I hear a salesperson saying something like, I hope that something will happen, I'm just
yeah.
like, oh my God, hope's the worst strategy
It
you could
is. Yeah,
have.
there was a book written by a gentleman that's called "Hope Is Not a Strategy," and they're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
Oh yeah. There you
And
go.
I, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it really, and a lot of times, Dennis, it kind of comes down to as a sales leader or as a CRO or especially
Yeah.
in tech startups and that, you have to get really good at, I'll call it focusing on what you can affect,
Yes.
as opposed
Yes.
to you
100%.
trying to do everything for them,
What's in your
right? It's like,
control?
and that's a big difference between you doing something versus teaching somebody how to go about
Yeah.
executing against the certain, and it's just a very very different kind of mindset that you need to have when you're doing
Yeah.
it, because so, like I said, the white knight type of sales leader, that's almost like what I would call founder led growth, right? And that's, it's
Yeah.
admirable, but it doesn't scale,
It's not
right? It
scalable.
won't
Yeah.
scale
Yeah.
the company. It's not
Yeah.
scalable.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to create something where you can grow and repeatedly grow
Yeah.
your company's sales and customers and things like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say that, the thing that you can, kind of take from my learning of, what things that I didn't
Yeah.
focus on when I was, having the failures, is that you need to focus on those things that you can affect. And one of the things was the people part of it that we talked about, right? And that's, how do you evaluate them and assess them that they're the right person for the right role? And then
Yes.
how do you then develop and build that team, right? Because
Yeah.
it is a team of individuals. I would tell you probably another thing that was a mistake that I remember when I was first a sales leader, and I would try to go out and I'm going, I should just hire people. I'm going to try to find people that are just like me, so I can
Yeah.
go. And
Yeah.
I know that it'll
Yeah.
be a big mistake. That was just dumb. And yeah, it ended up not working out well for me. But anyway,
Yeah.
but so you need to figure out how do you build and develop these people, and
Yeah.
it really gets into this idea of I tell people that if you can come up with go out and get really smart and good people, right, and
Mm.
then you figure out how to enable them. And there's not a one size fits all. Everybody kind of has their own way of how they assimilate things, learn things,
Yeah.
but how do you most effectively enable them to be the best they can be, right? Eliminate all the reasons why they can't be successful.
Yeah.
Try to give them as equal or an equivalent opportunity as you possibly can. And then basically hold them accountable to what our go-to-market strategy is, meaning
Yeah.
this is what the buying process looks like. And so that's how you're going to be able to matriculate opportunities through the pipeline. And so what are you doing to make sure that you're kind of following I don't want to call it the secret sauce, but the formula, and or you're qualifying appropriately or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Makes sense.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
on that point about the people, like
Yeah.
you talk a lot about like business athletes
Yeah.
in your book From Hustle to Scale. So for business athletes, like why are you so passionate about hiring business athletes?
Yeah. So, The reason why I am is I got an opportunity to go into a company, and it was probably one of the most invigorating and one of the most successful startups that I happened to go into. Right? And I was hired. The name of the company was Labissimo. I was hired as the SVP and GM of the enterprise business, which is effectively the CRO, and I had some other responsibilities. But
Yeah.
and the company had grown from organically, I guess, to about $8 million when I was brought on board. And they were primarily selling to practitioner types and more technical
Like the
types.
low level people.
Yeah,
you're
lower
saying.
level
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
in the IT organizations and things
Yeah.
like that. They wanted to transition their go to market to more of a how do we serve a line of business person or the economic buyer and that sort
Yeah.
of thing, right? And so what was the value to them? This is kind of
Yeah.
value-based selling type of thing.
Yeah.
And so we were pivoting the company strategy to target the customer experience market using big data to optimize their customer experience was really what we were trying to do with them. And we had this engine that, had big data and the ability to find data and to, make it
Interesting.
in context
Yeah.
and things like that. And so we had to transition to this, new go-to-market target and strategy, which then requires you to revamp your sales, AM, and services organizations to what I call the V2 profile for the role. And for each of the respective teams. And each of these new profiles, or ideal candidate profile, if you want to call it that, right, incorporated this business athlete criteria. And what I learned with the business athlete criteria is it's like these fundamental traits or characteristics about a person. And I can sit here and list them all off to you, but about a person that tells me that I have a high probability of them being successful, regardless of what role I put them in, because they possess these unique traits or characteristics, right? And the traits or characteristics aren't about, do you know a lot about this industry, or do you know a lot about, this technology, or, those types of things? Because what I've learned is those things change, and you can teach that to people if they're smart, right? One of the traits of a business athlete is somebody who has really, really good business acumen. But these other traits, the business athlete's traits, those aren't as teachable and or easily teachable. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And so I would use the profiles in this business athlete criteria to basically understand and assess whether it's the viability of the people that were on the team when I came in and I was hired, and or it was new hires that we were considering to bring into the team to help us to grow this business.
Yeah.
And I should tell you, during my experience at Vivissimo, it's a side note, and it's kind of hard to, when I went through it, but we ended up probably turning over approximately 80% of the field when I was there, which was like flying an airplane with, and trying to gain altitude with, one engine or less.
And how were you guys so sure that you needed to shift from low market to enterprise quickly?
How are we sure?
Yeah, that you needed to do it.
Because the value we were providing to the initial customers that we have was so massive.
Oh, wow.
It was massive.
Now you needed to capture the value. Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
We had Airbus was a customer of ours, John Deere was a customer of ours, and we sold it for pittance.
$100,000 a year.
Some, state and government agencies and things like that, but it was pittance. And so we're like,
what a nice problem to have.
Well, exactly, right? But we're like, and this idea of customer experience is like everybody was trying to figure out how do we use all this information and data, and so that we have distributed amongst all of our different functions, whether it was the product side of their business or it was their maintenance and operations or whatever it happens to be. How do we use that to make our customer experience better so we can monetize that and grow our business, right? So the value proposition is massive, but it's a big problem. But we were kind of hanging around in I'll call it the technological practitioner type people as opposed to the business people. And we knew that their more core systems, whether it was CRO systems or financial systems, they were getting massive amounts of, value from, and they paid a lot of money to get those. They paid, compensatory amount, right? So, anyway, or comparable amount. So, that's how we knew. We're like going, we're onto something here. We just got to figure out, how do we go about, what's the right go to market? What does the ICP, ideal customer profile, look like? What's the right, problems to be touting that we solve? And, how is that we're unique, and all those other good things that you do when you're doing your go to market. So we ended up doing that, and then, which required us to then go out and rethink, do we have the right people that can do this, or do we have people that are really good at transacting products? And so, and the results were, I guess, spoke for themselves, right? So I came in, we were 8 million. We ended up growing it to 75 million during my tenure. And from a sales and marketing perspective, that I'll call it the proof that it actually worked, and why we wanted to have business athletes and why we needed to shift our go-to-market was our average selling prices went from 250K to 650K.
Wow.
Yeah. The pipeline close rate went from 25, 30 to about 70, 75.
Was that a lot of ICP stuff, like just focusing the right targets and stuff?
Focusing on the right opportunities and the right size.
Yeah.
The sales cycles were a bit long, but because that's where we had the most value, right? This is the place where we had the highest probability of being successful, where we had the most value, and it was the most important for them, and it was consequential if they didn't do that, right? And then the company obviously was acquired by IBM, and for 10, 11 times revenues.
Wow. How many years was that growth? 8 million to 75 million?
It was over 3 years.
Wow. That's some story.
Yeah, but that's an example of where why I found focusing on hiring business athletes was important, because I had been doing it before, but I didn't really kind of formally characterize it until that experience.
Yeah.
And that one really solidified it. In addition, there's other things that went into this too. We did a good job with our go-to-market strategy and sales model and all that. But as I mentioned earlier, right, one of the big failings, or one of the things that I learned from failing in the first 4 starts, is if you don't have the right people in the right seats, it doesn't matter how good your strategy or how good your mission is, or what your processes are, you won't be able to execute.
In that example, right? Like, well, I won't presume anything. How many salespeople did you have when you were 8 million, and how many did you have when you were 75?
Boy, you're taxing my memory. We had roughly across. So we were in both in Europe and in the U.S., and we hadn't yet expanded into Japan. We did later, but or into Asia Pacific. But we had, I think, at that time when we were 8 million, we had probably like 5 or 6, and then a couple pre-sales SEs. They called them SEs. And in the selling side of things, we had some field marketing people that were helping with the demand stuff. And then I was the GM, and so I was also running the services organization, service and support. We had to do some things with integrations and stuff like that. But yeah, that was probably about how many people we had. 5 to 7, 8, 9, 10 people that were probably at 8 million when I came in.
Yeah.
And then we were probably around at, we were probably, I don't know. Let me think about this. Probably around in the sales organization, we were probably in the, I'll say 20, 25, something like that.
Okay.
Or sellers or SEs or application people.
Yeah. And the question I was getting to is like, when you went from 5 sellers to 22 or 20, whatever it was, like you could no longer pick and manage all those people, but you relied on others. Like, how did you make sure the quality of your candidates were staying high when it became less about you directly hiring and your team?
So what I did was, as we would continuously, evolve our go-to-market, kind of like what you're going through right now, right?
Yeah.
I was always a big proponent, and I think you recall this from our time together, but it's like always be recruiting, right?
Yeah.
But what I would do is, when I was in the business of, at that point when we start to scale, right, is the non-route recruiting leaders, right? And I would
Yeah.
always, kind of come to them and say, okay, so like, what's your plan or your framework when it comes to when you have to start building your team? What does that
Yeah.
look like for you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would make sure that, and if I felt they gave me reasonable, made sense
Mm,
to me, and I'm like, oh yeah, it seems like a good plan or a good approach to
yeah.
doing this. I would tell them that I come up with a kind of a system or methodology that does a good job at deciphering whether somebody is going to be successful or not in the role.
Yeah.
And what that consisted of was this, ideal candidate profile, which had the business, athlete characteristics and things like that.
Yeah.
You could get a lot of the, I'll call it the how they do things and what they did to get to the house out of their resumes and stuff like that. But I then wanted to, I'll say, inform them with here's some of the questions that I found to be a good way to, understand whether these people perform or possess those traits or characteristics or not.
Mm,
Because as you know, sellers are good at selling, right? And so they
yeah.
can sometimes
Themselves
ace
as
an
well.
interview and sell you,
Yeah.
go,
Yeah.
wow, that was blown away, right? But that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that it's congruent, meaning what they told you and what they actually believe or what they actually do.
Yeah.
So I kind of put together this, for lack of a better word, a script of questions, and you got to experience that. And so did some of the other people that I would say, this is
Yeah.
how you go about, determining whether they meet these criteria of a business athlete and the
Yeah.
ICP that we're doing. And that's kind of how I tried to, I'll say, extend the scalability of the hiring in the
Yeah.
organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great advice what you're saying there. Like I think a lot of sales leaders get maybe really good at hiring individual sellers, but
Yeah.
then with the managers, like it's really them and hiring
Yeah.
versus like selling. And well, it can be as well, depends on the kind of leader you're looking for. But
Yeah.
yeah, great
And I
point.
think it's a great question, Dennis. And I would almost put that back at you is what did you so when you and I started, right? You had gone out
Yeah.
and hired people and things like that. And then you kind of, I'll say, made a pivot. And so what did you do that you said, okay, now I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna be the one hiring these people. Pat's not gonna be hiring all these guys. What did you do in order to ensure that you were going to hit on the majority? We don't have 100% hit. None of us do, right? But what did you do differently
Yeah. Great
that you
question.
learned that to go ahead and have a higher hit rate?
Yeah.
And then what you needed to do in order to have management caliber, people in there?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Like I do think if you can get your hit rate high, and I think it is possible to get hit rates up to 75, 80%. I think anything above that.
You did it. I saw
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
were really you basically went from you had these, folks that were just, you kind of went with, I
Yeah.
call it the traditional, well, they have experience in this
Yeah.
industry
Yeah,
or this
yeah.
company and that.
Yeah.
And then, so
Yeah. Yeah.
what did you do that flipped the
Yeah.
script? Because you did a
Yeah,
great
yeah.
job of it
What would I
and you
say?
really improved your,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like I would say the point you made earlier, and a lot of people I respect in the industry have said this to me, is like
Mhm,
always be hiring. Like
mhm,
even when you're very busy and everything, like you're gonna if you get into a situation where you're in a rush to hire, you're going to make mistakes, and it's probably better to wait, even if that's painful. So I would say number one, like don't hire anyone that you're not like super excited about. And if there's
yeah.
something that's a gut feeling that's off, or someone you really trust that had like an issue or something, like dig in a bit more. um I would say earlier when I was hiring my first hires, I was kind of like always looking for like, okay, they were at this company we're trying to be. I remember at Tubular, we used to think like ComScore. We want to be
Yeah.
ComScore or whatever, or Nielsen or whatever. And I quickly changed to more like, okay, just like this candidate standing on their own 2 feet, what have they done previously? And back to your point about like the ICP of the candidate, like, do you need someone who absolutely loves new business?
Mhm.
And if they say to you in the interview something like, I'd be a bit nervous about not having a book of business, run from the hills. Just this is not a good fit.
Yeah.
Like that person doesn't enjoy the chase maybe as much.
Yeah.
Or an account manager just thinking about the traits and attributes they need to be. And then it's kind of like sales, getting good pipeline in. if you don't have good pipeline, then you can't be more selective. And the last one I would say is like seeing someone doing a task that you think will be a very common task for their job, whether that's pitching or maybe an SDR, they're actually having to pick up the phone and go cold. Even a lot harder these days, it's more email and stuff. But basically doing a situational task where you can judge them fairly, beforehand.
Yeah. And I like that. I think you're spot on that. And I think to your earlier point, which is I call, where you're saying don't try to, rush it or force fit something. I used to tell you guys, remember, I would say it's a Patism, I think, and it was, bad breath is not necessarily better than no breath.
Yeah.
And so you got to make sure, don't put someone in because you need to have, right? Don't do that. That's just going to kill you, right?
Yeah.
And I think, as you talked about, you guys did a great job. And I remember you were like the spearhead of this when we were at Navissimo, which was, let's have them go ahead and, we're not going to expect them to be experts about our product or anything, but let's just have us look at how would they go about approaching selling something like our value proposition or prospecting our value proposition or verifying with the candidate about our value proposition through a simulated presentation. And that gets back to the, what we were talking about earlier. So you've got an ICP that includes all these business athlete traits, which is more about, I'll call it that. Some of that has the how and the what, what do they do and how do they do it? And that's what I think it was an awesome thing that you guys did with the simulation of them doing a sales case. And then the business athlete stuff really gets into the why, right? And those questions. And like you talked about, which is, I don't have a book of business. You're like, that's not why this person is going to be successful or why they want to do this role. Because this role is not about that. It's about you're Lewis and Clark. You're out exploring the world.
Yeah. Great. All right, Pat, I think we'll close it out there. Great first episode. I think there's great lessons you've given everyone around things to avoid and to improve their chances of being more successful in their leadership roles. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I've really enjoyed doing our first podcast, and here's to many more to come. And hopefully those of you that are out there listening to it get a couple of nuggets of value, and we'll keep pressing on and try to deliver more.
Yeah, and thank you for joining Closing Time with Pat and Denis. Bye.